The morning Delia Shelton decided her life would never include a man who looked at her with soft eyes and a tender mouth was the same morning she walked into the general store in Harlan Creek, Kansas, and nearly knocked a stranger flat onto a crate of dried beans. It was the spring of 1882, and the town of Harlan Creek sat stubborn and sun-bleached on the edge of the prairie like a boot heel pressed into the dirt, refusing to move. The wind came off the flats in long, warm gusts that smelled of sagebrush and turned soil, and the main street ran straight as a rifle barrel from the livery stable at one end to the small white church at the other. Between those two landmarks lived every hope and disappointment the town had ever produced, housed in the dry goods store, the barber shop, the post office, and me Thurston's boarding house, where the curtains in the front window had been faded pink for so long that nobody remembered they had once been red. Delia was 26 years old, and she had lived in Harlan Creek for all of those years except the first two, when her family had still been making the long push west from Missouri. She was not a woman who inspected herself in mirrors more than necessity required, and necessity, she had decided early, required very little. She had dark brown hair she kept braided and pinned at the back of her head, brown eyes that noticed everything, and hands that were calloused at the knuckles from the garden and the washboard and the 100 daily tasks that kept a small farm from falling back into the prairie. She was 5 feet and 4 inches tall, solidly built, and she wore sensible dresses in sensible colors, mostly dark blue and gray wool in the winter and plain cotton in the summer. She owned one good dress for church, which was dark green with a white collar, and she wore it without any fuss or particular pride. People in Harlan Creek liked Delia. They trusted her with their problems, borrowed her preserves recipes, and sent their children to her when they needed someone to read with them, because Delia had a patience for teaching that Mrs. Aldrich at the schoolhouse sometimes lacked. But nobody in Harlan Creek had ever looked at Delia Shelton and thought the word beautiful, and Delia had made a private, steady peace with that fact years ago. She was plain and she was practical. She knew how to stretch a sack of flour through a hard week, how to set a fence post straight, how to treat a wound with what she had on hand, and how to keep her face calm when something hurt. These things, she had decided, were worth more in a real life than a pretty face. The morning in question, she had come into Harlan's general store for lamp oil and thread. She had her list in her head the way she always did, a running inventory she kept without paper, and she pushed open the door without slowing her stride because she had done it 1,000 times and the floor was always clear. It was not clear that morning. A man had crouched down directly on the other side of the door, his hat on the floor beside him, his hand on a sack of beans he had apparently been examining for quality. He was tall enough that even crouching he occupied considerable space, and when Delia hit him with the full forward momentum of a woman who never slowed down, they both went sideways. He caught himself with one hand on the floorboard and caught her with the other, his arm wrapping briefly but firmly around her waist so that she did not hit the floor, and they ended up in an awkward, tangled nearness with their faces about 8 inches apart. He had gray eyes. She noticed that first. Gray as a sky that has not quite decided to storm, and there was a quality in them that was direct and unhurried, as if he spent his life looking at things carefully before he made up his mind about them. He had dark brown hair that was in need of a cut and a jaw that had not seen a razor in about 3 days, and the lines around his eyes said he had spent a great deal of time outdoors, squinting at horizons. He was maybe 30, she thought, possibly a year or two on either side. "I beg your pardon," he said immediately, and his voice was deep and even. "That was entirely my fault. Are you hurt?" "I am not hurt," Delia said, and she stepped back from his arm with a smooth, dignified movement that she hoped communicated that this sort of thing happened to her frequently and meant nothing. "I should have watched the door. I should not have been in front of it," he said. He stood up, and yes, he was tall, a full head above her, broad in the shoulders in the way of someone who had done hard physical work for a long time. He retrieved his hat from the floor and held it against his chest. "Gilbert Mercer," he said. "I arrived yesterday from Wichita." "Delia Shelton," she almost said, and then caught herself. She said it anyway because the alternative was saying nothing and walking away, and while she had nothing against walking away, she had been raised with manners. "Delia Shelton," she said. "I farm about 3 miles south of town." "You farm," he repeated, and he said it without the small upward note of surprise that she had learned to brace for from strangers, the implicit question of a loan. He said it the way someone says a thing they have filed away as information. "Is the land good out that way?" "Depends on the year," she said honestly. "The soil is decent, but the water table is temperamental. I manage." He nodded as if she had said something that confirmed something he had suspected. "I appreciate a plain answer," he said. She picked up her basket from the floor where it had fallen in the collision and walked toward the counter, and she told herself firmly that gray eyes and good manners were not enough reason to think about a man twice. She thought about him twice. She thought about him while she was waiting for Amos Harlan to measure out the lamp oil, and again while she was selecting thread, and she was irritated with herself for it. She was a practical woman. She had been through one near engagement, at 22, to a man named Carl Briggs who had courted her for 3 polite and comfortable months before losing interest in her for the schoolteacher, Mrs. Aldrich's predecessor, who had come from Ohio with yellow hair and a laughing mouth. Delia had watched Carl follow the yellow-haired schoolteacher down the street, once with an expression on his face that she recognized as the look of a man who has found what he truly wanted, and she had understood, with a clarity that hurt cleanly and healed cleanly, that she had never inspired that look. She had kept her head up and got on with her life, and she had been getting on with her life very efficiently ever since. She did not need gray eyes, she needed lamp oil. She paid for her things and walked out into the spring morning, and she did not look back into the store to see if Gilbert Mercer was still there. He was, in fact, still there, and he watched her go. Amos Harlan, who had been running his store for 20 years and regarded himself as the town's unofficial historian and social commentator, said to Gilbert Mercer after the door swung shut, "That's Delia Shelton. Her daddy passed 3 years ago and left her the farm. She runs it herself. Has a hired man named Otis come in twice a week for the heavy work, but the rest is all her." Said Gilbert. "Most men in this county don't quite know what to do with a woman like that," Amos said. He was a large, comfortable man who enjoyed imparting information. "She doesn't fuss over herself, doesn't simper or flutter, says what she means and means what she says. Some find it off-putting." "I find it refreshing," Gilbert said, and he turned his gray eyes back to the bean sacks with an expression that Amos Harlan would later describe to his wife as the most focused look he had ever seen on a man in a mercantile. Gilbert Mercer had come to Harlan Creek because of land. He had spent the last 8 years working as a cattle drover and a ranch foreman across 3 different operations in Texas and Oklahoma, saving carefully and methodically, and he had come north with enough money in a St. Louis bank to buy a small piece of ground and start something of his own. He was 31 years old. He had no family left to speak of after losing his mother 6 years ago and his father before that, and he had decided with the same quiet deliberateness he applied to everything else that it was time to stop working other men's land and start working his own. He had also decided, though he told no one this because it was the kind of thing that sounded foolish out loud, that he wanted a life that was built on something solid. He had watched plenty of men chase women who shone brilliantly in firelight and dimmed just as quickly when hard times came. He had watched beautiful romances collapse under the first Kansas winter or the first failed crop. What he wanted, and he knew this with the same certainty he knew which way the wind was blowing and whether the sky was going to hold, was a woman who was built for the actual life he was planning to live. Someone honest about who she was. Someone steady. Someone who said things plainly and meant them. He had not expected to find that description confirmed in 8 seconds by a woman who nearly knocked him over on his second morning in a new town. He spent the rest of that week getting settled. He had taken a room at Me Thurston's boarding house and was spending his days riding out to look at the parcels of land that were available in the surrounding county, taking notes, asking the right questions, and sleeping the deep sleep of a man who had done good honest work all day. He met the other regular boarders, a telegraph operator named Peter Dawes who had been there 2 years and had a comfortable chair and a proprietary attitude toward it, and a widow named Mrs. Clara Foote who was visiting her sister and played the harmonium badly every Sunday morning. He ate Me Thurston's cooking, which was plain and generous, and he listened to the general conversation of the town the way he always listened to new places, with patience and without judgment. He heard Delia Shelton's name 3 more times that first week, and each time it was spoken with a kind of matter-of-fact respect that you did not always hear directed at a woman alone. Old Tom Barker at the feed store mentioned that she had brought him a pot of soup when he broke his ankle 2 winters ago and had not made a production of it. The minister's wife, Mrs. Cole, mentioned in passing that Delia taught the younger children to read on Tuesday afternoons, unofficial and unpaid, simply because the schoolhouse was overcrowded and some of the smallest ones were falling behind. And the blacksmith, a heavy-set man named Rupert Frame, mentioned that she had talked the county land agent out of a bad surveying arrangement that would have cost 3 neighboring farms their water rights, by showing up to the meeting with a ledger full of documentation and refusing to sit down until the matter was settled correctly. By the end of the first week, Gilbert Mercer knew considerably more about Delia Shelton than she would have been comfortable with him knowing, and he had not yet found a parcel of land that suited him. He found both solutions to both of these problems at the same time, which was not entirely an accident. He had ridden south from town on a Thursday morning, following a tip from Amos Harlan about a piece of ground that a family called the Whitmores had quietly made available after deciding to push further west to Colorado. The land was 3 miles south of town, and the road he was on, a 2-track dirt path pressed into the grass by years of wagon wheels, passed through some of the most promising soil he had seen since arriving in the county. The wheat grass along the edges was thick and green. The grade was gentle enough to manage water without excessive effort, and there was a good tree line to the north that would break the worst of the winter wind. He slowed his horse, a steady roan gelding he called August, and he took his time looking. He always did this when he saw land that interested him. He sat very still and he listened, not to anything particular but to the quality of the place, the way the breeze moved through the grass, the sound of the soil. He was sitting this way when he heard a fence post being driven. It was coming from the other side of a low rise to his left, and he sat up straighter at the sound because it was a rhythmic, efficient sound, the kind made by someone who knew how to use a mallet without wasting effort. He walked August up the rise and looked over. Delia Shelton was driving a fence post into the ground with a wooden mallet. She had her sleeves rolled to the elbows and her braid was coming slightly loose at the back, and she was working with the kind of concentrated efficiency that meant she had done this before and was not interested in doing it twice. There was a line of posts already placed along the fence line, and the broken section she was repairing was about 20 feet long. She had dug the holes herself. He could see the spade leaning against the post she had finished, and she was holding the current post steady with her knee while she drove it with both hands over her head. He should have ridden on. He would have ridden on, had the post not twisted at the last moment when she hit it, torquing sideways in the soft earth and pulling a wrenching noise out of her that was not quite a cry but was close to one. She stepped back and looked at her hand, and even from the rise he could see she had caught a splinter or a pinch bad enough to make her stop. He was off August and walking down the rise before he had fully decided to. "I saw the post go sideways," he said, announcing himself from 20 feet away so he would not startle her. "Can I give a hand?" She turned and looked at him, and there was a brief, controlled moment where he watched her register who he was and then set her expression to something neutral and self-sufficient. "Mr. Mercer," she said, "you do not need to." "I know I do not need to," he said pleasantly. He reached her. "But I am here and you have hurt your hand, and I have spent 8 years driving fence posts." He looked at her hand, which she had curled slightly in a way that meant it was hurting her, and she did not want anyone to know it was hurting her. "May I look?" There was a pause. Then she opened her hand. There was a deep splinter along the pad of her palm, the kind that had gone in at an angle. It was going to be difficult to remove cleanly on her own. He looked at it carefully. "Have you something sharp at the house?" he asked. "A needle," she said. "That will do it," he said. "If you'll let me, I am reasonably good at this." She looked at him, and he had the feeling she was running calculations behind her eyes, weighing things. Then she said, "All right, come to the house." He tied August to the fence she had been working on, and he followed her across the field to a farmhouse that he registered with quiet appreciation before she opened the door. It was a well-kept house, a solid timber structure with a stone foundation and a deep covered porch, and the yard around it was tidy and practical. A kitchen garden already showing early green at one corner, a root cellar door set into the earth nearby, a woodpile stacked properly in the lee of the barn. There were chickens. There was a serviceable vegetable garden. There was nothing ornamental except a single rose bush growing beside the porch step that had clearly been there for years, older than any other deliberate planting, and he thought it might have been her mother's. Inside was the same. Clean, simple, organized. A parlor that was also clearly a working room, with a mending basket on the table and a row of canning jars on the shelf and a solid iron stove that had been polished until it respected itself. Books on a shelf beside the window, practical ones, a farm almanac, a medical guide, 2 or 3 novels worn soft with reading, a braided rug on the floor. No fuss. He sat at the kitchen table because she gestured him there, and she brought a needle and a clean cloth and the lamp she lit without ceremony because the light was better with it, and he took her hand in both of his and worked the splinter out with care and patience, which took about 4 minutes. She did not flinch except once, near the end, and she looked at the wall above his head the whole time with the expression of a woman who has decided to get through something. "Done," he said, when the splinter was out and the cloth was pressed to the small welling of blood. He kept her hand in his one moment longer than necessary. He was aware of it, and then he set it gently down on the table. "Thank you," she said. She got up and wrapped the cloth more firmly around her palm. "I will finish the fence line," he said. She turned from the counter. "You will not." "It will take me an hour," he said, "maybe less. I can see you have more posts to set and the ground is soft from last week's rain, which means if you leave them the wet will shift the holes by morning and you will need to redress them." There was a silence. He could see her working through the irritation of needing help and the practicality of knowing he was right about the holes. Practicality won, as he had suspected it would. "I will bring you dinner when it's done," she said, which was clearly her version of thank you. "I would not say no to that," he said. He went out and drove the remaining posts, which took him somewhat less than an hour because he did not waste movements, and when he came back to the porch she had a plate of cold roasted chicken and cornbread and a cup of coffee waiting on the step. She sat on the step herself with her own cup, which surprised him, and he sat on the step below her and ate with the appetite of someone who had done real work. They talked, and this was the thing that surprised him most, not the talking itself but the quality of it. She did not make conversation for the sake of filling silence. She said things when she had something to say, and what she said was almost always interesting. She told him that the ground he had been looking at to the north of her property, the Whitmore land, had good soil but a drainage problem along the east quarter that was not visible in dry weather and only showed itself in a wet spring. She told him this not to discourage him, but because she thought it was information he should have before he made a decision. He asked her 3 specific questions about the drainage, and she answered all 3 with the precision of someone who had paid close attention to the land around her for a long time. "Have you a neighbor to the north of the Whitmore parcel?" he asked. Ben Aldridge, she said. He is fair. He does not like women much, but he is fair in business. You say that without particular bitterness, he observed. He is not the first man who did not like women much, she said. And he patched the fence between his property and mine without my asking when the winter storm took it, so I account him fair. Gilbert thought about this. He drank his coffee. The late afternoon light was turning the prairie gold, and the wind had settled to almost nothing, and the quality of the silence was that particular warm silence that seems to rest on a farm at the end of a working day. I should tell you that I intend to ask if I may call on you, he said. She went very still. I am telling you first, he said, because I would rather you have the information clearly than have me simply appear one day and have you wonder at my intentions. She looked at him sideways. You do not know me, she said. I know more than you might think, he said, and I would like to know the rest. She set her cup on the step and turned to look at him fully for the first time, and her brown eyes were doing that thing he had already noticed, the running of calculations, the weighing of things. Mr. Mercer, she said, I am going to tell you something directly because you seem to prefer direct. I do, he said. I am plain, she said, and I am practical. I am not the kind of woman who inspires grand feelings in men. I have been told so, indirectly and in ways that were meant to be kind, and I have no quarrel with it. I am useful and I am steady, and I will outlast 3 women who are prettier than me in a Kansas winter. But I am not romantic. I am not charming. I do not have yellow hair or a laughing mouth, and I never will. So if you are looking for that sort of woman, you should know before you waste your time that I am not her. She said all of this without self-pity, which was the most remarkable part. She said it the way she talked about the drainage problem on the Whitmore land, as information he should have before making a decision. He looked at her for a long moment. The golden light was on her face, and her braid was still half fallen from the afternoon's work, and her hand was still wrapped in the cloth, and she was looking back at him with steady, unsentimental eyes. Delia, he said, and he said her name for the first time with a naturalness that made her blink. I have been looking for plain and practical my whole life. She stared at him. I have watched more bright, laughing, beautiful women charm the boots off men who then spent the next 20 years wondering where their good sense went, he said. I have been offered twice by women who were quite lovely, something that I could see very clearly was not built for the life I intend to live. I want ground that does not shift under me. I want someone who says what she means and means what she says and does not stop making sense when things get hard. He picked up his coffee cup. I am not flattering you. I am telling you what I am looking for and telling you that it is what you have described yourself as being. The silence that followed this was a different kind of silence than the warm evening one. It had an edge to it, a held breath. You have been in this town 6 days, she said finally. 8, he said. 8 days, she said. You do not know me well enough to know any of that. I know enough to want to know more, he said. That is all I am asking, permission to know more. She looked away across her field to where the fence posts he had driven stood straight in the evening light. She looked at them for a long time, and he let her look because he had patience enough to wait for a real answer. You may call on Sunday, she said at last, after church. He said thank you, and he meant it the way she would have meant it, plainly and without decoration. He came on Sunday. He brought nothing because she had not struck him as a woman who wanted flowers brought to her door in a performative way, and instead he arrived at 2 o'clock in the afternoon and asked if she wanted to walk the property line to the east, which she had mentioned had a low area she was considering for a small irrigation ditch. They walked for an hour and a half. They talked about the ditch and about the wheat crop she was planning, and about the water rights situation she had resolved with the county agent. And when they came back to the porch, there was a natural, easy quality to the conversation that surprised Delia more than she wanted to admit. He was not what she had expected. She had expected condescension, the patient, benevolent kind that well-meaning men often brought to conversations with a woman about her own land. He had none of it. He asked her questions and waited for the actual answers. When he had knowledge relevant to something she was working through, he offered it without making a performance of the offering. When he did not know something, he said so without any embarrassment. He came the following Sunday and the one after that. By the fourth Sunday visit, they had settled into a pattern that was easy and natural enough that Delia found herself preparing for it on Saturday without quite noticing she was doing it, not in a fussy way. She did not suddenly buy ribbon or leave her hair down, but she made sure there was good coffee on hand, and she cleared the kitchen table of the papers she had been working through. And she noticed she was doing it with the kind of quiet anticipation she had not felt since before Carl Briggs and the yellow-haired schoolteacher. On the fifth Sunday, he found her in the kitchen garden because she had gone out to check the green onions and lost track of time, and he came around the corner of the house and found her kneeling in the dirt with her hands deep in the soil, and instead of hanging back at the gate, he came and crouched beside her and looked at what she was looking at, which was a row of carrots that had come up thinner than she had planted for. "Did the birds get into them?" he asked. "Possibly," she said. "Or the cold snap last month. It came later than I expected." He looked at the spacing, the color of the nearby soil, and said, "If you reseed this section now, you may catch enough warm weeks to get a second set through." "That is what I was thinking," she said. They knelt there together in the dirt for a moment, and the ease of it, the complete absence of self-consciousness about being in the soil together, struck her suddenly, and she looked at him sideways and he looked back at her, and they both simply sat there for a beat, looking at each other in the plain afternoon light with garden dirt on their hands, and something shifted in Delia's chest with a sensation she had not felt in so long she almost did not recognize it. She recognized it. She stood up and brushed off her hands and went inside to put the coffee on, and she was very careful with her face until it settled. Gilbert Mercer had begun to understand, around the third Sunday, that he was in very serious danger of falling entirely in love with Delia Shelton, and he had not taken any particular steps to avoid it because it felt like exactly the right danger to be in. He liked everything about her. He liked the way she thought, which was thorough and honest and did not take shortcuts. He liked the way she laughed, which was not often but when it happened was genuine, a low, warm sound that she seemed briefly surprised by each time, as if delight still caught her off guard. He liked the way she moved through her work, without complaint and without drama, with the same steady competence she brought to everything. He liked that she had opinions about crop rotation and kept them even when he disagreed with them, which he did twice, and both times the subsequent conversation turned up something useful for both of them. He had bought land by this point. Not the Whitmore parcel, but a piece about 1.5 miles north of Delia's property, on higher ground with better drainage, that had come available through a different arrangement. He had begun breaking ground and making plans. He had a small temporary structure up, barely more than a good shelter, and he was planning the house properly, taking his time with it. He had hired 2 men part-time from town, a young man named Percy Hale who was strong and eager, and an older hand named Walt Simmons who had forgotten more about framing and masonry than most men ever learned. The town of Harlan Creek had noticed, with the efficiency of a small town that notices everything, that Gilbert Mercer was calling on Delia Shelton on Sundays. The reaction was mixed in the way that a small town's reactions are always mixed, mostly benevolent but speckled with complication. Me Thurston approved heartily and expressed this to everyone she met. Amos Harlan said thoughtfully that it seemed a solid match to him. Peter Dawes at the boarding house said good for her, meaning Delia, with such genuine feeling that Me Thurston gave him an extra biscuit at breakfast. There were also, inevitably, 2 or 3 women in town who had harbored a quiet interest in the new arrival themselves, and who processed this interest by suggesting, in the careful way of women who did not wish to be caught being unkind, that Gilbert Mercer might be settling. The phrase settling was deployed with a delicacy that made it worse, not better. It reached Delia's ears through the reliable transmission system of a small town, not directly, but carried in the careful non-mention of it by me Thurston, who brought it up specifically to dismiss it, which meant she was bringing it up. "People say foolish things," me said, when she came for a Tuesday afternoon visit and began, unprompted, by saying that some people said foolish things. And I will not repeat what foolish things are being said because they do not merit repeating. "Me," Delia said with the patience of long friendship, "if you do not repeat them, I will imagine things worse than what was said," me told her. Delia sat with it for a moment. She was at the kitchen table with her mending in her lap, and she set it down and looked at the window. "And what do you think?" she asked. "I think a man who looks at a woman the way that man looks at you is not settling," me said firmly. "I have been watching men for 60 years and I know what settling looks like, and it does not look like that." "How does he look at me?" Delia asked, and she was mortified immediately that she had asked it, because it was not the kind of question she asked. Me's expression went soft. "Like he's found something he has been looking for a long time," she said, "and like he is not entirely sure it is real yet, and so he is being very careful not to startle it." Delia picked up her mending and said nothing, and me Thurston smiled the smile of a woman who has delivered a piece of information well. The following Sunday, when Gilbert came, Delia was in the house and not in the garden, and she had made ginger cake because she had remembered in passing that he had mentioned the previous week that his mother had made ginger cake. She had made it the way she made everything, without announcement or ceremony, and she set it on the table when he sat down with the same matter-of-fact efficiency she brought to setting down a coffee cup. He looked at the cake and then looked at her. "You remembered," he said. "It is not a complicated recipe," she said, sitting down across from him. He cut a piece and ate it with a careful attention that was nothing like casual, and then he said, quietly and without looking up from the plate, "My mother would have liked you very much." She had no response ready for that. She had prepared herself for many things, for awkwardness and the wrong kind of attention, and the subtle condescensions of a man who thought her competence was charming but secondary to things she did not have. She had not prepared herself for a quiet, serious statement about a dead woman's likely opinion, delivered with the weight of something that genuinely mattered. "Tell me about her," Delia said. He told her. He talked about his mother for most of an hour, which was the most personal thing she had heard him say in 5 weeks of Sundays, and she listened with the quality of attention she brought to everything worth listening to. And at the end of it, she understood him better than she had before in a way she could not have described precisely, but felt with considerable certainty. He left at dusk as he always did, and at the door he paused and turned back and looked at her with those gray, careful eyes and said, "I would like to come more than Sundays, if that would be acceptable." She thought about it. "Tuesday and Sunday," she said. "I have the children for reading on Tuesday afternoons, but the evenings are free." "Tuesday and Sunday," he agreed, and he put his hat on and walked out to August, and she stood in the doorway and watched him ride north in the fading light and told herself she was watching to make sure he had the gate. She was not watching to make sure he had the gate. The Tuesday visits were different from the Sundays. On Sundays, they talked and walked and occupied the easy middle ground of two people getting to know each other. The Tuesday evenings had a different quality, something quieter and more particular, because by the time he arrived the day's work was done, and the children had gone home, and there was nothing that needed doing, and two people with nothing that needed doing find themselves in closer territory. They sat on the porch on the warm evenings, and she brought the mending out and he whittled, which he did with the same automatic efficiency as everything else, his hands moving without his attention so that his attention was free for the conversation. He was making a small box, she noticed over several weeks, a careful, well-fitted box with notched corners. She did not ask what it was for because she had her own policy about not asking what a thing was for until a man was ready to tell her. He told her on the third Tuesday evening in June, when the fireflies were coming up from the grass and the heat of the day had broken into something comfortable. He turned the box over in his hands and said, "I meant this to be useful for keeping small things, thread maybe or pins." "For whom?" she asked, though she thought she knew. He looked at her. "For you," he said, "if you would have it." She held out her hand and he gave her the box. She turned it over, looking at the clean corners and the small, careful hinge he had fashioned for the lid. It was plain and well-made and useful and beautiful in the way that plain, well-made, useful things are beautiful. "It is very good work," she said. "You can say thank you," he said, with the small, crooked half-smile he had that he seemed mostly unaware of. "Thank you," she said. And then she said, because it was Tuesday evening and the fireflies were coming up from the grass and she had spent enough weeks being careful, "Gilbert." He looked at her. She had not used his first name before. "I am beginning to think," she said carefully, looking at the box in her hands, "that you are a genuinely good man." There was a pause. Then he said, "I am trying to be." "That is all a person can do," she said. They sat in the good silence after that, the kind of silence that is not empty but full, and the fireflies rose up into the dark air around the porch, and the warm Kansas night held them in it. And Delia Shelton sat with a box made for her by a man who had been looking for plain and practical his whole life and felt, with slow and certain clarity, that this was the thing she had not let herself hope for. It was Amos Harlan's wife, Eleanor, who first said the obvious thing out loud. She said it to me Thurston, who said it to Peter Dawes, who mentioned it in passing to Gilbert, entirely by accident, while they were both at the breakfast table one morning in early July. Peter Dawes said, referring to something else entirely, "It does seem like you're making permanent arrangements out there." Gilbert looked at him. Peter Dawes realized what he had said and colored slightly. "I only meant the house," he said. "The building." Said Gilbert. He rode out to Delia's farm that afternoon, which was a Wednesday, not a Tuesday or a Sunday, and she came to the door at the sound of August's hooves, with a look on her face that was trying to be neutral about the fact that he had come on a Wednesday. "Something wrong with the north boundary?" she asked, because they had been discussing a drainage issue along the north boundary of his new property. "No," he said. He swung down from August and stood there with his hat in his hands, and she stood in the doorway, and the afternoon was bright and clear around them. "I came because I have something to say and Tuesday is too far away." She stepped back from the door and he came inside and she put the coffee on, and he stood at the kitchen table without sitting because some things you did not say while sitting down, and he looked at her straight back while she was at the stove and he said, "Delia, I want to ask you to marry me." She went still. Her hand was on the coffee pot. "I am not asking because it is practical," he said. "Though it is practical, and I think you would see that clearly enough. I am asking because, when I am here, I feel right in a way that I have not felt in any place I have ever been. I am asking because you are the most honest person I have met in my life, and because I trust you with anything, and because the thought of you being 3 miles south and me being 1.5 miles north for the rest of our lives seems like a waste that I am not willing to accept." She turned from the stove and looked at him. Her face was doing the calculating thing, and he waited. "You are certain," she said. "Not just decided, certain." "I am certain," he said. She looked at him for a long, level moment, and he looked back at her and held it, because this was not a moment for looking away. "Yes," she said. He exhaled. Just that one single breath released, and the relief in it was so genuine and so unguarded that she crossed the kitchen and stood in front of him and looked up at him at close range, and he looked down at her and he put his hands on either side of her face, very carefully, and kissed her for the first time. It was a gentle kiss, warm and unhurried, and it tasted of certainty. She kissed him back with the same plain directness she brought to everything else, and when they separated she kept her hands on his forearms for a moment, steadying herself, because the world had shifted slightly under her feet. "The coffee is going to boil," she said. He laughed properly, a low, surprised sound that she had not heard from him before, and she went back to the stove with a warmth in her chest that she had no intention of diminishing by examining it too closely. They married in September, at the white church at the end of Main Street, on a morning when the sky was the precise deep blue of early autumn, and the air had the first cool edge of the season coming in from the north. The ceremony was small because Delia wanted it small. Me Thurston was there, and Amos and a leaner Harlan, and the minister's wife, Mrs. Cole, and Peter Dawes, who sat in the back and looked profoundly moved by everything. Delia's neighbor, old Tom Barker, who had been her father's friend for years, sat in the front row and wiped his eyes with a handkerchief so large it could have been a small flag. Otis, her hired man, came and stood near the door in his good shirt. Delia wore the dark green dress with the white collar, and she had done her hair slightly differently, still pinned at the back but with a small softness to it that Me Thurston had achieved with gentle persistence on the morning of the wedding. She carried no flowers except a single stem of late prairie aster that she had cut from her own fence line on the way into town, because that had seemed right. Gilbert wore a dark suit that he had bought in Wichita before coming to Harlan Creek, thinking, with the particular forward planning that was characteristic of him, that there might be occasion for one. He looked at Delia when she came down the church aisle, and his face did the thing that Me Thurston had tried to describe to Delia months before. It was not a dramatic thing. It was a quiet, serious, utterly genuine look of a man who has found what he was looking for. And it was more than Delia had ever expected to be looked at, and she walked toward it without flinching. After the ceremony, there was a small gathering at Me Thurston's boarding house, which Me had insisted on organizing, and which produced an amount of food significantly in excess of what 12 people could reasonably eat. There was pie. There were 3 kinds of pie. There was a layer cake that a leaner Harlan had made, and a considerable quantity of lemonade, and Peter Dawes made a toast that was surprisingly eloquent for a man who spent most of his time transmitting other people's words. Old Tom Barker pulled Gilbert aside before the afternoon was over and looked at him very directly and said, "You take care of that girl." Gilbert met his look with equal directness. "I plan to," he said, "though I suspect she will be taking considerable care of herself regardless." Tom Barker studied him for a moment and then nodded slowly and offered his hand, and Gilbert shook it, and that was that. They rode back to Delia's farm that evening, because it was the larger and more established place and the practical arrangement. Gilbert had already moved his essential belongings, and the farm that had been Delia's father's, and then Delia's alone, had Gilbert's hat hanging on the peg beside the door and Gilbert's boots standing by the hearth. And these additions seemed to Delia not like intrusions, but like the final pieces of something that had been slightly incomplete. She stood in the kitchen at the end of the wedding day, after the lamp was lit and the outside sounds had settled to crickets and the very distant low of cattle from Tom Barker's property, and Gilbert came and stood behind her and put his arms around her from behind, and she leaned back against him with the complete, undefended ease of someone who has found the place where they fit. And they stood in the kitchen of her father's house in the lamplight, and she felt more at home than she had since before her father died. "I meant what I said at the church," he said quietly above her head, "every word of it." "I know you did," she said. "You mean everything you say." "So do you," he said. "Yes," she said, "I do." They lived the first year together with the kind of deep satisfaction that comes from 2 people who are genuinely suited to each other discovering, in real daily life, that they were right about the suiting. There were no great revelations, no dramatic discoveries of hidden incompatibility. There were instead 1,000 small confirmations. The way he saw what needed doing without being told. The way she did not need things managed for her, but welcomed his presence in the doing of them. They shared the work without arguing over its division because it divided naturally between their capacities and preferences, and when there was work neither wanted to do, they either rotated it or did it together. They argued sometimes, as real people do. They argued once, at length and with some heat, over whether to plant the south field in wheat or corn, and both of them made their case fully and neither of them was entirely wrong, and they eventually arrived at a compromise that combined elements of both positions. They argued about money once, which was more uncomfortable but more brief, because they both took practical finances seriously, and once the numbers were on the table, the conversation resolved itself. Gilbert had a habit, when he was thinking hard about something, of going very silent for long stretches, and Delia had initially read this as distance until she understood it was concentration, and once she understood it, she stopped minding. He had a habit, when she was frustrated, of occasionally offering a solution when what she actually wanted was to finish being frustrated without someone trying to fix it, and she told him this once plainly, and he adjusted without defensiveness. The adjustments, the small ongoing adjustments of two lives genuinely becoming one life, were not painful. They were interesting. They were, Delia thought sometimes, the thing nobody ever told you was the actual substance of love. Not the early fire of feeling, but the long, patient, interested work of knowing someone more completely over time. She was pregnant by the following spring. She told him the way she told him anything, directly and without ceremony, sitting at the breakfast table on a Wednesday morning in March with the early light coming through the kitchen window. She said, "I believe I am with child." He put down his coffee cup. He looked at her, and his gray eyes had that quality she had come to know, the absolute stillness before something important. "Are you certain?" he asked. "As certain as I can be," she said. "I will have me come out next week and confirm it, but I am fairly certain." He stood up from the table and came to her side and crouched beside her chair, which put them at the same level, face to face, and he took her hands in his, and she saw his expression, which was joy, the clear, uncomplicated kind that men who keep their feelings close very rarely show, and the sight of it made something in her chest open up like a door in the warm season. "Delia," he said. "Yes," she said. He kissed her hands, both of them, in the plain kitchen morning, and then he held them, and she thought that she would remember this moment for the rest of her life, and that she would not need to make it larger than it was because it was already exactly as large as it needed to be. Me Thurston confirmed the pregnancy the following week with the brisk efficiency of a woman who had attended enough births to have opinions about them, and immediately thereafter became the most enthusiastically involved person in the situation that was not actually Delia or Gilbert. She knitted. She had opinions about what Delia should eat and how much she should rest, none of which Delia followed precisely, but all of which she considered. She arrived on 3 separate occasions with casseroles. The summer passed with the particular golden quality of a time that is full and good. Gilbert finished the framing on the addition he was building on the east side of the house, a proper room that would serve as the child's room, and which he built with the care he brought to everything. He and Percy Hale worked on it through the long evenings after the day's farm work, and Delia sometimes sat on the porch in the warm dusk and watched them, and listened to the sound of hammers and the comfortable back and forth of 2 men working on something good. The pregnancy was not easy at the end. Delia was unwell in the last 2 months in ways that frustrated her profoundly, not frightened her but frustrated her, because she did not like being limited. She could not lift what she was accustomed to lifting. She could not work the garden as she liked. She found herself sitting more than she had ever sat in her adult life, and she minded this acutely. Gilbert absorbed the shift in her working capacity without comment, which meant he did more without making a production of doing more, and when she expressed frustration about being limited, he did not tell her she was fine or dismiss her irritation. He said, "You are growing a person. That seems like fair grounds for temporary limitation." She thought about this. "That is a reasonable way to put it," she said. "I thought it might help to hear the investment framed in terms of output," he said. She looked at him. "Gilbert Mercer," she said, "are you making a farming analogy about my pregnancy?" "I might be," he said. She laughed, the low, warm, surprised laugh, and he smiled the crooked half-smile, and they were still sitting there grinning at each other when Me Thurston knocked on the door with another casserole. The child came in November, as the first real cold settled in. It was a long labor and a hard one, and Gilbert spent 11 hours doing what men of that time did, which was exist in the general vicinity of a thing that was happening to someone he loved, and over which he had no control, which for a man of Gilbert Mercer's particular temperament was very nearly unbearable. He sat on the porch in the cold and he talked to Tom Barker, who had appeared without being asked, because Tom Barker understood what it was to wait, and he stood at the bedroom door twice and was turned back by me Thurston, with the no-nonsense authority of a woman who knew exactly what she was doing. The child arrived at just past 3 in the morning, and it was a boy, and he was healthy and loud about being healthy. And when me Thurston came out and said he could come in, Gilbert walked into the bedroom and sat on the edge of the bed beside Delia, who was exhausted in a way that went beyond anything he had words for, and he looked at her and she looked at him and she said, "A boy." "I heard," he said. His voice was not quite steady. "How are you?" "Tired," she said, "but fine." She looked at him more carefully. "Were you worried?" "Yes," he said without qualification. She reached out and put her hand on his arm. "I am fine," she said, "and he is fine. Come see." He looked at his son for the first time, and the expression on his face was one that Delia put away very carefully in the best part of her memory, because it was the look of a man encountering something that has made the world larger than he knew it was. They named him James, after Delia's father. James Robert Mercer, the Robert being Gilbert's father's name, and the combination of the two was agreed upon over the breakfast table the morning after the birth with the same straightforward collaborative efficiency they brought to everything, which made me Thurston, who was present for breakfast having not left overnight, so delighted that she had to excuse herself to the porch for a moment. James was, from the beginning, a child of extraordinary lungpor and strong opinions, which did not surprise anyone who knew his parents. He grew through his first year with the robust determination of something that was going to be substantial, and by the time he was pulling himself upright against the chair legs, he was clearly going to be tall. Harlan Creek itself continued its slow growth through these years. The railroad had pushed a spur line to within 12 miles of town by 1884, and there was active discussion of whether it would extend further. New families arrived. A second mercantile opened, which Amos Harlan regarded with dignified competitive concern. The schoolhouse was expanded, and a proper second teacher was hired to handle the overflow, which relieved Delia of the Tuesday afternoon reading sessions and gave her back those hours for the farm, though she found she missed the children more than she expected. She mentioned this to Gilbert one evening in the spring of 1884, when James was 16 months old and sleeping behind the closed door of his room with the particular heavy silence of a child who has spent the entire day running at things. "I missed the reading sessions," she said. "I did not expect to." Gilbert was at the table going over the farm accounts. He set his pencil down and gave her his attention, which he always did fully when she was saying something worth saying. "The new teacher takes that over?" he asked. "She does," Delia said, "and well, but it was something I liked." He looked at her thoughtfully. "There is no reason the new teacher's handling of the schoolhouse prevents you from teaching," he said. "There are always children who fall behind. The schoolhouse was overcrowded before, and the new teacher is managing it. But managing a large group does not always catch the ones who need individual attention." Delia looked at him. "You could ask if there are children who would benefit from additional help," he said. "As you did before." She sat with this for a moment, rolling it. It was, she thought, characteristically him, not telling her what to do, not managing her toward a resolution, but reflecting back a possibility she had been too close to see. "Yes," she said. "I could." "You could also," he said, with a careful neutrality that she had learned to recognize as him holding something back to see how she responded to the first part, "teach reading from here on certain afternoons if the schoolhouse cannot house them." She looked at him for a moment. "You would not mind," she said. It was not quite a question. "Delia," he said, and the warmth in his voice when he said her name had never diminished and still caught her slightly off guard. "I have never for one moment wanted you to be smaller than you are. If this is something you want, then we should think about how to make it work." She had, over 2 years of marriage, received many gifts from Gilbert Mercer. She had received the small wooden box with its careful hinge. She had received the East Side room, built with his own hands. She had received his patience and his constancy, and the gray-eyed steadiness that had never once wavered. But this, she thought, this particular way he had of looking at her life and seeing room in it for her to be the full size of herself, was perhaps the most extraordinary gift of all. She started the informal school that fall. 4 children at first, ranging in age from 6 to 9, all of them struggling for various reasons with reading and letters. She set up the kitchen table and she taught Tuesday and Thursday afternoons, and Gilbert managed the farm on those days with Percy Hale, who had become a reliable fixture on the property, and had developed a particular attachment to young James that involved a great deal of piggyback riding and the gifting of small hand-carved animals. James, who was nearly 2 and therefore interested in everything that happened in his vicinity, sat in the corner of the kitchen on teaching afternoons with a collection of wooden blocks and an expression of intense intellectual engagement, with the proceedings that suggested he was absorbing considerably more than anyone expected. By 1885, there were 7 children in the kitchen on teaching days. By the following year, 9. Delia was 30, and she was happy in a way that was not simple or static, but was deep and real and growing. She understood, in a way she would not have before, that happiness of the kind she had once imagined to be unavailable to her was not the kind she would have wanted anyway. The kind she had was better. It was built from things that lasted. The second pregnancy announced itself in the spring of 1886 with the same matter-of-fact certainty as James had, and Delia told Gilbert at the breakfast table on a Tuesday morning, and he put his coffee cup down and looked at her, and the joy was the same as before, the clear, uncomplicated kind, but this time with something added to it, a depth that came from knowing now what that joy grew into over time. "How are you feeling?" he asked. "Fine at the moment," she said. "Ask me in 6 weeks." He reached across the table and covered her hand with his. "I will ask you every morning," he said. "That seems excessive," she said. "Probably," he said. "I will ask anyway." He asked every morning. She tolerated it with the patient amusement of a woman who knows exactly what she has. James took the news of a coming sibling with 2-year-old equanimity, which is to say he appeared to consider it briefly and then went back to the wooden blocks. Delia watched him and thought that he was, in many ways, remarkably like his father. He considered things, set them aside when he had decided on them, and returned to the matter at hand. The second child was born in December of 1886, another long labor but not as difficult as the first, and it was a girl this time. She arrived loud and vigorous, as James had, and was immediately claimed by her brother the following morning, when Gilbert brought him into the bedroom to meet her, and James stood at the edge of the bed and looked at her with the solemn intensity of someone taking on a responsibility he had not been explicitly assigned, but had decided was his. They named her Ruth after Gilbert's mother, Ruth Delia Mercer. Delia had not known she would be asked to contribute her name to the child's, and the asking of it, quietly and directly at the breakfast table on the second morning, when she was still in that tender raw state of having just produced a new person, made her look at her husband with an emotion that she did not have a plain word for, and that she suspected she was going to have to simply carry as a feeling for a while before it organized itself into something she could say. She said it eventually. She said it 3 weeks later on a Sunday evening in January, when the snow was coming down outside and James was asleep and Ruth was asleep, and the house was warm and quiet, and Gilbert was sitting in the chair by the fire, and she was at the table with her mending and the lamplight was on both of them. "I love you," she said. She said it the way she said all important things, plainly and without preamble, looking directly at him. He looked up from the fire. He looked at her and he said, "I know," with a simplicity that was not casual but absolute, meaning I have known for a long time and I have been waiting for you to be ready to say it. "I wanted you to know that I know," she said. "What do you know?" he said gently. "That you were right," she said, "about what you were looking for." He held her eyes. "So were you," he said, "right about yourself." "Plain and practical," she said. "Exactly right," he said. And then he said, with the certainty of a man who has looked at a thing for long enough to know it entirely, "and exactly what I needed." She set down her mending. She crossed the room to the chair by the fire and she sat beside him, and he made room for her naturally, the way two people do when they have learned each other's shape over time. And she leaned against him, and the fire was warm and the snow was outside and the children were sleeping, and she thought, "This is it. This is the thing. This is every single thing." Years moved through Harlan Creek the way years do in prairie towns, in the rhythm of seasons and harvests and the small news of neighboring lives. The railroad reached within 2 miles of town by 1888, and the town expanded along its line. New streets laid out in the optimistic grid of a place that expects to grow. Amos Harlan expanded his store. The church was enlarged, and a new minister came when old Reverend Cole retired. Tom Barker, who was very old and had been telling everyone for 3 years that he was extremely old and did not know how much longer he would last, outlasted several people who had been younger and healthier, a fact he reported with satisfaction every time someone mentioned it. James grew into a boy of 6, and then 8, and then 10, with the steady upward progress of something well planted and well tended. He was serious and curious, and spent a great deal of time following Percy Hale around the property asking questions about everything, and Percy answered all of them with a patience that endeared him permanently to both of James's parents. James also, by the time he was 8, had a facility with numbers that made Gilbert first notice it with surprise, and then with a quiet, private delight that he did not overexpress because he did not want to put pressure on the boy. He mentioned it to Delia instead, one evening, and Delia said she had noticed it 2 years earlier, and they looked at each other with the expression of two people who are in the same conversation about the same person, and finding it exactly as good as they expected. Ruth, who was 18 months younger than James, and made a complete mockery of the idea that younger children were quiet or easy, was a force of considerable personality. She had her mother's dark hair and her father's gray eyes, and a temperament that seemed to be entirely her own, which was direct, loud, enthusiastic, and absolutely unmoved by any difficulty that she had decided not to let move her. She fell down constantly and got up constantly, and seemed to regard the falls as an interesting source of data rather than a reason to slow down. Delia taught her children the way she had taught the children in her kitchen, with patience and high expectation and the absolute conviction that a child who was taken seriously would take itself seriously. James learned to read at 4 and was deep into the farm almanac by 6, not because he was told to, but because he was interested in what it said. Ruth learned to read at 4.5 and immediately redirected her reading energy toward arguing points from the books more effectively, which Gilbert found privately hilarious, and Delia found occasionally exhausting, and both of them found wholly unsurprising. Delia's kitchen school had become, by 1889, a formal arrangement. The school board, which had been reorganized the previous year, and now included 2 women in an arrangement that had been controversial and then proven useful, had formally recognized her role in serving children who needed additional support. She was paid a modest stipend for it, which she had not expected, and which she took without false modesty because the work had value, and being paid for work that had value was sensible. She moved the sessions to the schoolhouse on Tuesday and Thursday afternoons in a dedicated hour after the regular school day, which freed her kitchen table from the obligation and gave the children more space. There was a girl named Anna Kepler who came to the sessions in the fall of 1889, the daughter of a German farming family who had arrived that summer and who spoke English imperfectly and was struggling badly in the school's regular sessions. She was 7 years old, and she had the specific kind of endurance that comes from being a child, who is trying very hard in a situation that is very difficult. And Delia recognized it immediately because she had seen it before, and because it was a thing she respected. She spent extra time with Anna Kepler. She found the few German words she knew and used them to bridge gaps. She talked to Anna's mother, who spoke no English at all, through the patient intermediary of hand gestures and drawings and the very small amount of German she could manage. And she communicated clearly enough that Anna was making progress and the family should not be worried. She sent Anna home with books that were designed for younger children than Anna was, not to embarrass her but to give her a stable floor to stand on, because you could not build up if you had nothing under your feet. Gilbert watched this with the same quiet, steady attention he brought to everything about Delia, and one evening when the children were in bed and the house was quiet he said, "You know you do not have to take on the hard ones." "I know," she said. "But you always do," he said. "The easy ones do not need me," she said simply. He looked at her across the table and said nothing, but his gray eyes were warm in the lamplight and she could read him after 7 years well enough to know what nothing said in that tone of voice meant. She said, "Gilbert Mercer, do not look at me like that." "Like what?" he said. "Like I have done something admirable," she said. "I am just doing what makes sense." "Yes," he said. "I know. That is why I am looking at you like that." She set down her pencil and looked back at him, and they sat across the kitchen table from each other in the good lamp light, and the years of their life together were in the room with them, not as weight but as warmth, and the window showed the dark Kansas sky full of stars above the flat prairie, and she thought as she had thought many times that she would not trade this for anything that shone more brightly or looked more remarkable from the outside. Anna Kepler, for what it is worth, learned to read English with genuine fluency by the following summer, and told her mother in a mixture of German and English that Mrs. Mercer was the best teacher in the world, which Anna's mother repeated to Delia with a smile and the universal language of a mother who is grateful for someone who saw her child. In the spring of 1890, something happened that shook the settled quality of life in Harlan Creek in a way that required the kind of steadiness that Delia had always been built for. There was a fire. It started in the night at the feed store, from a stove that had not been properly damped, and it spread in the dry April wind to the adjacent building, and then to the one beside that before anyone could organize a meaningful response. The town had a bucket brigade tradition but no real equipment, and by the time the fire was out, the feed store, the adjacent harness shop, and half of the old boarding house that predated Me Thurston's establishment had been destroyed. Nobody was killed, which was the relief that came before everything else. But 3 families were displaced, and the feed store loss was a serious blow to the farmers in the surrounding county who depended on it before the next planting. Delia responded to this the way she responded to every problem, practically and immediately. By the morning after the fire, she had already been to see each of the 3 displaced families and established what they needed most urgently and which of those needs could be met from what was already available in the community. She organized, without being asked to organize, a distribution of surplus food from those who had it to those who needed it, working through Me Thurston's kitchen and the church hall, and the patient assistance of Mrs. Cole and Alina Harlan. Gilbert contributed from their own stores without hesitation, and he and Percy Hale and Walt Simmons, who was 63 but not yet done with useful work, joined the group of men who began clearing the burned site within days so that rebuilding could begin. The county land agent, stung perhaps by his previous encounter with Delia's documentation, was unusually responsive about the insurance questions that arose, and Peter Dawes at the telegraph office worked double days for a week transmitting communications to insurers and county authorities on behalf of the affected families. The feed store was rebuilt by summer. One of the displaced families, a young couple named Bill and Harriet Coombs who had been living above the harness shop, were housed by Me Thurston at no charge for 6 weeks, which Me announced she was doing, and then deflected all thanks for with the cheerful efficiency of a woman who is too busy for sentimentality. The Coombs family, once re-established, became part of the durable fabric of Harlan Creek, the way that people do when a community has shown them what it is made of. Harriet Coombs sent her eldest to Delia's Thursday afternoon sessions the following fall, and Delia found the boy sharp and quick, and spent a pleasant afternoon explaining to him why letters made the sounds they did, which he found fascinating in the way that certain children find the mechanics of things fascinating. James Mercer, who was 9 at this point and had accompanied his father to the rebuilding efforts on several Saturdays, came home one of those evenings and said to Delia very seriously, "Papa worked harder than any of the other men today." "Your father works hard at everything," Delia said. "He does not seem to get tired," James said. "He gets tired," Delia said. "He just does not stop." James considered this. "Is that what you do too?" he asked. Delia looked at her son. "Yes," she said, "that is generally what you do. When something needs doing, you do not stop because you are tired, you stop when it is done." James was quiet for a moment, working through this in the way he worked through things, thoroughly and without shortcuts. "I think I can do that," he said. "I think so too," she said. He was, she thought, going to be a good man. He had the architecture for it already. Ruth, for her part, had opinions about the fire that she delivered at the dinner table with characteristic volume, primarily related to the unfairness of the situation for the displaced families and what she thought should be done about it, most of which were not practical at the scale of what an 8-year-old could accomplish, but all of which came from a place of such genuine indignation on behalf of other people that Delia and Gilbert exchanged glances over her head that contained equal parts amusement and pride. The years after the fire were good years. The farm flourished. The additional acreage that Gilbert had been working steadily since they married was now fully productive, and they had increased their wheat yield substantially through the combination of his knowledge of soil management and Delia's accumulated observation of how the land around her had behaved over 20 years. They were not wealthy by any standard that implied luxury, but they were secure in the solid, deep way that means you are not afraid of what the next season will bring, because you have built something that can absorb the hard seasons and still stand. The land itself had come to feel to Gilbert like something he had always known, which was the particular gift that happens when a man finds the right piece of ground. He had spent 8 years moving across other men's land, and he had loved pieces of all of it. But this specific stretch of Kansas prairie with its particular quality of light in the late afternoon, and the way the grass moved in the summer wind and the smell of the soil after rain, had become in 7 years what home meant, so thoroughly that it was impossible to imagine having found it anywhere else. He thought sometimes about the morning he had crouched in front of the bean crates in Amos Harlan's store. He thought about it with a quality of disbelief that was entirely specific, the disbelief of someone who knows how easily things might have been different. He might have been looking at a different parcel of land. He might have been standing in front of the door rather than crouching. She might have slowed down. He had not yet told her about this particular train of thought, and then one evening in the summer of 1891, when they had been married 8 years and James was 10 and Ruth was 9, he did. They were sitting on the porch in the long evening light that Kansas does in summer, that golden hour that lasts longer than it has any right to, and he told her about the moment in the store and the quality of disbelief he still carried about how easily it might have been different. She listened to the whole of it as she always did. Then she said, "I have thought about it too." "Have you?" he said. "The door," she said. "If I had been looking where I was going, I would have seen you there and I would have stepped around you, and we would have exchanged polite words and I would have bought my lamp oil and gone home." "And then," he said. "And then probably nothing," she said, with the plainness that she always brought to uncomfortable truths. "I was not in the habit of looking. I had stopped expecting anything from that direction." He turned to look at her. The evening light was on her face and she was looking out at the field, at the wheat that was headed out in the long rows, and her expression was the one she had when she was seeing something clearly. "I am glad you were not looking," he said. "So am I," she said. He reached over and took her hand, which was still calloused at the knuckles in the same places as the first day he had noticed it, and she turned her hand in his and held it, and they sat in the summer evening on their porch, and the wheat moved in the warm wind, and the sky went through its gradations from gold to amber to the first deep blue of evening. "Gilbert," she said. He said, "I want to tell you something." "Tell me," he said. "When I told you that day," she said, "that I was plain and practical and not the kind of woman who inspires grand feelings, I believed that, entirely." "I know you did," he said. "I want you to know," she said, "that I was wrong." She paused in the way she paused before saying something she had thought about carefully. Not about being plain and practical. That part was accurate, but about the rest of it, about what those things are worth and what they might inspire. She looked at him. "You taught me that I was wrong about the rest of it." He looked back at her, and his gray eyes were full of the evening light and full of the 8 years and full of everything that was between them, which was considerable by now. "You taught yourself," he said. "I only said what was already true." "You said it when no one else had," she said. "Their loss," he said simply. She laughed, the warm, low laugh that still came as a surprise, and he smiled the crooked half-smile that she would not have recognized in the first weeks, because it was not the expression he showed to most of the world. And they sat in the evening on their porch in the life they had built from plain and practical foundations, and it was everything. Amos Harlan retired in the fall of 1892, at 70, and sold the store to a young man named Frederick Crane, who had come from Ohio with good business sense, and a quiet wife and 2 small children. Amos remained in Harlan Creek because he had built his life there over 20 years and had no intention of going anywhere. And he transitioned with remarkable grace into the role of man who told Frederick Crane useful things about how the store worked and the preferences of the regular customers. A role he occupied with the same generous, expansive energy he had always brought to everything. He told Frederick Crane about Delia Shelton, meaning Delia Mercer by then, and that she preferred plain speech and good lamp oil, and if you gave her both, she was one of the most reliable customers you would ever have. Frederick Crane filed this away and conducted himself accordingly. Me Thurston remained at the boarding house and remained the central node of the town's social information system, as she had always been, and she aged into it with the dignity of someone who has occupied their proper place in the world. She was at the Mercer house for Christmas in 1892, along with Tom Barker, who was now genuinely extremely old but still walking under his own power, and reporting the fact with satisfaction, and Peter Dawes, who had married the previous year to a woman named Grace who was very quiet but had, it turned out, a wit so dry it took a moment to register, and whom Delia liked very much immediately. The Christmas gathering filled the Mercer kitchen and spilled into the parlor, and was dominated by James and Ruth competing, with good-natured ferocity, over who could tell the better story about something that had happened at school that fall, each story growing slightly, with each retelling in the way of children who have discovered that an audience appreciates a good narrative. Gilbert sat in his chair by the fire and watched his family and his community in the warm noise of a good Christmas, and there was on his face the expression that had no single word for it, the expression of a man who has arrived where he was trying to go. Delia caught his eye from across the room, and he raised his coffee cup slightly, and she raised hers, and they looked at each other for a moment across the noise of Christmas and the children's voices and the warmth of the fire, and then they both went back to the company around them, carrying the moment between them like something they had agreed to share. By the time James was 12 and Ruth was 11, the Mercer farm had become one of the more established operations in the surrounding county, not the largest but one of the most carefully managed, and Gilbert had developed a reputation among the neighboring farmers as someone worth talking to about soil and water management, in the practical way that reputations grow in agricultural communities, by word of mouth from someone who had taken a piece of advice and had it prove out. He was asked twice to speak at the county agricultural meeting, which he did with the same straightforward plainness that he brought to everything, saying what he knew and not embellishing it. Delia was asked the following year to serve on the school board, the second woman to do so after Eleanor Harlan, who had blazed that particular trail with her usual serene determination. Delia served on the school board with the organizational competence that characterized her approach to everything, and the specific concern for the children who were falling behind that had always driven her. She pushed for and eventually obtained a small fund for buying additional books for families who could not afford them, which was not a large fund, and was not achieved without some argument but was real and was used. She was in her late 30s by this point, and she looked it in the way of a woman who has spent years outdoors and worked her body hard and not spent energy trying to look differently than she was. Her dark hair had threads of gray in it that she had no intention of disguising, and her hands were as calloused as they had ever been, and she was plainly and practically and undeniably herself, more fully herself, she thought, than she had ever been before. She thought sometimes about the girl she had been at 26, who had made that clear-eyed peace with what she believed was available to her and what was not. She thought about that peace, which had been real but had also been a kind of protective narrowing, a setting down of hope so that hope could not disappoint her. She thought about what she might have missed if a tall man with gray eyes had not been crouching where she was walking, and the thought went through her like a long, cold current, not of sadness, but of vertigo at the contingency of things. She said something like this to Gilbert one evening, and he listened carefully and then said, "I have been thinking something similar from the other direction." "What do you mean?" she said. "I mean that I was 31 when I came here," he said. "I had been looking in a general way for the life I wanted, not in the specific sense of looking at women and making assessments, but in the broader sense of knowing what I was building toward and not having found the piece that fit. I was not unhappy. I was functional and purposeful, and I had a plan. But the plan had an absence in it that I was becoming, by 31, quietly concerned might remain an absence." He paused. "And then you walked through a door." She looked at him. "I walked into you," she said. "There is a distinction. You walked into me," he agreed, "and everything after that was you." She put her hands around her coffee cup, and she felt the warmth of it and the warmth of the kitchen and the warmth of the man across the table from her, and she thought, this is what a full life feels like. Not perfect, not simple, not without hard years and hard seasons and worry about the crops and the children and the things that go wrong because things always go wrong. Full, real, held by something that is genuinely holding. Tom Barker died in the spring of 1893, which was a grief to the whole town and a particular grief to the Mercer household, because he had been a connection to Delia's father and to the earliest years of her life in Harlan Creek. He died at home in his bed at a great age, with the satisfaction of a man who had done everything he intended to do and had been given enough time to do it. He left his property to a nephew in Colorado, but he left his chair, the large wood and leather chair that had been in his parlor for 30 years, to Delia, with a note in his careful old handwriting that said, "To Delia Mercer, who is the best of what a Harlan Creek woman ever was." She put the chair by the fire in the parlor, and for a long time she sat in it when she read in the evenings, and it felt right there. James turned 14 that year, and was growing into the clear shape of who he was going to be, which was a man of his father's build and steadiness, and his mother's directness and capacity for attention. He was already helping with the full work of the farm, not as a child helper, but as a genuine working contributor, and he had a facility with the horses that was natural and unlearned, the ability to read what a horse was about to do that comes from paying close attention and not flinching. Ruth at 13 was reading everything she could get her hands on and had developed a passionate interest in the law, specifically in the ways that the law applied or did not apply to women, and to those without power, which she had learned about through the newspapers that came weekly from Wichita, and which she discussed at the dinner table with an intensity that occasionally made Percy Hale, who joined them for dinner on Fridays, look around the room with the expression of someone wondering how he ended up in a conversation this serious. Gilbert listened to Ruth's opinions on the law with the same quality of attention he gave everything. He did not dismiss or condescend, and he did not perform agreement when he disagreed. He pushed back on specific points, courteously and directly, and Ruth pushed back on his pushback, and Delia watched these exchanges with a private satisfaction that she did not express outwardly but felt very fully. She thought, watching her daughter argue a legal point with calm ferocity, about what it was to be 14 and to believe that your opinions had weight, that what you thought about the world had bearing on it. She thought about herself at 14 and about how different the road had been. She was glad for her daughter's road. The last years of the 19th century moved through the Mercer farm the way the seasons did, with their own rhythms and their own demands. There were good harvests and there were dry years, and there was one terrible winter in 1895 when the cold came in early and hard and held for 10 weeks, and the cattle losses across the county were significant. The Mercer cattle losses were less than most of the neighbors, because Gilbert had been watching the early signs and had moved the herd to the sheltered southern pasture 3 days before the worst of it came, and because Delia had ensured the feed stores were adequate 2 months before anyone else was thinking about it. They came through the hard winter intact, not without cost, because hard things always have cost, but intact and together. And when the spring came and the ground thawed and the first green came back into the grass, Delia stood at the kitchen window in the early morning light and felt the specific relief of having survived something difficult and being on the other side of it. And Gilbert came and stood beside her and looked out at the greening field and said nothing, because nothing needed to be said. James, who was 17 during that hard winter, worked alongside his father and the hired men without complaint, and with a competence that was no longer that of a boy learning, but of a young man who knew what he was doing. Percy Hale, who was in his 30s now and had been with the Mercer farm for over 10 years, treated James with the collegial respect of a man who recognizes genuine capacity, and James responded to this by working even harder, which was very James. Ruth, 16 during that winter, managed the household through the worst weeks with her mother, and the experience gave her something that changed the register of her certainty from passionate to grounded. She still had her opinions and still expressed them with full force, but there was something in them afterward that was different, the quality of someone who has stood in a real storm and come out the other side with more information than they had going in. The turn of the century came to Harlan Creek as it came everywhere, with a particular collective consciousness of time and change, the weight of 100 years finishing and another beginning. There was a gathering at the church on New Year's Eve of 1899, the whole town together in the cold December night, and Delia stood beside Gilbert in the church with James, who was 21 now and standing at his full height, which was his father's height, and Ruth, who was 20, and she looked at the faces of the people around her, me Thurston with silver hair and the same clear eyes, Amos Harlan very old now but present, Alina Harlan beside him, Percy Hale near the back standing straight. The newer families who had come in the last decade and become as much a part of the place as anyone, and she thought about what it meant to have lived a life somewhere, to have put your hands into a piece of ground for a long time and had it give back. The minister said something about entering a new century with faith and with the courage to meet what came, and Delia listened and thought that the courage to meet what came was something she had never needed to be told about, but that she was glad to be meeting it with the people around her. Gilbert put his hand in hers in the dark of the church and she held it, and James stood at her other side with his shoulders square, and Ruth stood at Gilbert's other side not quite standing still, because Ruth never quite stood still, and the old century ended, and the new one began in the warmth and light of the small white church at the end of Main Street in Harlan Creek, Kansas. Afterward, walking home under the cold stars, James fell into step beside his father and Ruth walked beside her mother, and Ruth said, unprompted, "I think I want to study law. Actually study it, not just read about it." Delia said, "Tell me how you are thinking about doing that." And Ruth told her, at length and with the specificity of someone who had been thinking about this for a long time and had actual plans. And Delia listened with full attention in the cold, starlit night of the first hours of the 20th century and thought, yes, there she is. There is my daughter. James took on more and more of the farm's daily operation through 1900 and 1901, not because Gilbert was unable, but because it was the natural succession of a capable young man stepping into responsibility, and Gilbert made room for it with the same lack of ego he brought to everything, working alongside his son rather than in front of him, letting James make decisions and sometimes make mistakes and learn from both. The farm did not shrink in this transition. It grew, in the particular way that things grow when they are being handed from good hands to good hands. Ruth went to Wichita to study in the fall of 1901, at 22, with a determination that had been building for years and a small trunk of belongings, and 3 books that Delia pressed on her at the last minute, 2 practical and 1 novel that had meant something. Gilbert shook Ruth's hand at the train station and then, in a departure from his characteristic restraint, pulled her into an embrace that made Ruth, who was also not given to public displays, hold on for a moment before stepping back with bright eyes. Delia embraced her daughter on the train platform in Harlan Creek on a September morning and said quietly into Ruth's dark hair, "You are ready. You have been ready." Ruth said, against her mother's shoulder, "I learned that from you." Delia held her daughter for one more moment and then let her go, the way you let the things you have grown go when they are ready to go out and do what they were grown for, and she watched the train until she could not see it anymore. She and Gilbert drove home in the wagon in the mild September morning, and she did not cry because she was not a woman who cried at practical things, but there was a silence in the wagon that he let her have for most of the way home, and when they turned onto the south road that led to the farm he said, quietly, "She is going to do remarkable things." "Yes," Delia said, "she is." They came home to the farm, which was full of the ordinary work of an ordinary day, and Percy Hale had the morning chores well in hand, and James was in the south field doing something with the fence, and the chickens were in the yard, and the rosebush beside the porch step, which was very old now and had survived more Kansas winters than most things, was putting out its last small blooms of the season. Delia went inside and put the coffee on and stood at the kitchen window and looked out at the field where James was working, and then Gilbert came in and stood behind her the way he had stood behind her in this kitchen for nearly 20 years, and she leaned back against him the way she always did, with the ease of something that has been practiced until it is natural, and she looked out the window at the land they had built their life on. "Gilbert," she said. "Yes," he said. "Are you content?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment, not the hesitating quiet but the considering kind. Then he said, "More than I knew how to want for myself when I was young enough to be wanting things." She turned in the circle of his arms and looked at him, this man with gray eyes and the jaw that had not seen a razor in several days, which had not changed in nearly 20 years, and the lines around his eyes from squinting at horizons which had deepened with the years and suited him, and the hands that had driven her fence posts and removed her splinter and built the room where her children had slept and worked this land beside her for 2 decades, and she thought, there it is. There is the thing. "So am I," she said, "more than I knew how to want." He kissed her, as he had kissed her 10,000 times by now, as if they had figured out something together that neither of them could have figured out alone, and the coffee was on the stove, and the field was green outside the window, and the old rosebush was blooming beside the porch step, and James was working the fence in the south field, and Ruth was on a train going toward her future. And the new century was young, and the farm was solid, and the life they had built from plain and practical materials was as beautiful as anything that had ever been built anywhere. The letter from Ruth that Christmas was 3 pages long and told them that she was doing well in her studies and that she had found her footing and that Wichita was large but navigable and that she had met another woman studying law who had become a friend. And at the very end of the letter, in the particular way of Ruth, who saved certain things for the last line because she knew how to place them, she wrote, "I want you both to know that what I understand about how to live, I learned from watching you." Delia read this letter at the kitchen table on a December morning and passed it to Gilbert, who read it and set it down, and they both sat with it for a moment. That letter from their daughter. And the kitchen was warm, and the morning light was coming through the window, and James was in the barn, and the farm was alive around them in the good way that a farm is alive when it is properly tended, and everything that had been built from that morning in Amos Harlan's store, from that collision at the door, from that plain and honest admission about who she was and that equally plain and honest response about what he had been looking for, was present in this room, in this life, as real and solid as the table under their hands. Gilbert looked at Delia across the table, and she looked at him, and between them was everything. The years, the children, the hard winters and the good harvests, the learning of each other in the long, patient way of two people who are genuinely trying to know one another, the small box with the careful hinge on the shelf where she still kept her thread, the chair by the fire that had been Tom Barker's, the fence posts he had driven on an April afternoon before he had any right to be driving her fence posts, the kitchen table where she had taught reading to children who needed it, the porch step where they had sat in the firefly evenings of the first year, the green dress with the white collar that hung in the wardrobe and that still fit, the rosebush beside the door that had outlasted everyone who had ever lived in this house. Between them was all of it, plain and practical and profound, and it was exactly what both of them had always needed, and it was more than enough, and it was good. The winter of 1901 settled in around the Mercer farm with the particular gentleness of a season that is going to be manageable, not mild exactly but fair, the kind of winter that a well-prepared farm receives as a matter of course. James managed the livestock through the cold months with the competence that had become his signature, and the wheat was dormant under the hardened ground, waiting for the spring the way wheat had always waited, with the patience of something that understands its own nature. Delia and Gilbert sat by the fire on the long winter evenings, sometimes talking and sometimes not, sometimes reading and sometimes just being in the same room in the particular comfort of two people who no longer need to fill the silence with anything, because the silence itself is part of the company. She mended. He whittled. She had boxes enough by now to fill a shelf, each one slightly different from the last, some small and some larger, one with a carved border that he had made in the winter of their third year when he had more time and considerable ambition. She kept different things in them now. Thread in one, small coins in another, seeds in a third that she was saving from the best specimens in the kitchen garden for the next planting. She thought sometimes about the woman she had been before, standing at doors that did not open, having made her peace with the walls. She thought about it without grief, because grief was not the right shape for a thing that had been wrong and had been corrected. She thought about it with the equanimity of someone who has come through something to a better place and knows it and does not need to perform gratitude for it, but carries it quietly and genuinely. She was happy, plain and practical and happy, just as she had always been and more than she had ever expected to be, and the two things were not in contradiction. The plain and practical had not kept the happiness out. They had been the very materials from which it was made. And Gilbert Mercer, who had ridden into Harlan Creek in the spring of 1882 looking for ground that would not shift, and had found considerably more than that, sat across from his wife in the firelight of the first winter of the 20th century, and felt the specific gratitude of a man who asked for what he actually needed and was given it in full measure, and knew exactly what he had, and had never for a single day taken it for granted. The farm would go on. James would take it forward into the new century, and whatever the new century would bring, and he would do it with his father's steadiness and his mother's directness and a capability entirely his own. Ruth would write her letters from Wichita and then from wherever she went after that, and those letters would be full of the particular Ruth combination of practical information and passionate opinion, and the occasional last line that said something important. Percy Hale would be there every morning with the work done and the quiet loyalty that had never wavered. Me Thurston would bring casseroles as long as she had strength to carry them. And Delia and Gilbert would sit by the fire on the winter evenings and walk the land in the spring mornings and work side by side through the planting and the harvest and say what they meant to each other with the plainness that had always been their native language, and the years would be good and full and real, and they would be, both of them, exactly what they had said they were, plain and practical and precisely right for each other, and they would know it, and they would be glad.